Hello and welcome to my session today on vSphere Lifecycle Management with Dell OpenManage. My name is Ben Evans and I'm the Technical Architect Manager here at ComputerWorld. So a little bit about me first. There's my bio slide on the screen now. I've worked for ComputerWorld for about 6.5 years or so and spent a lot of time discussing with customers and clients vSphere upgrades and how best to go about them, sort of ranging back to the days of vSphere 4 all the way up to vSphere 7. So this is a topic I've got a sort of lot of knowledge around, and hoping to share some sort of hints and tips with you today, and also introduce you to what's new with vSphere 7 and how we can make updates a little bit easier. So on the agenda, so before we talk about the new stuff, I'll just cover off the old stuff. So that's talking about VUM and how we've traditionally upgraded our clusters and our environments using Update Manager. I'll then jump into what is vSphere Lifecycle Manager and how it works. And then speaking a little bit about Dell OpenManage integration for VMware vCenter. So this is the glue that holds the Dell side of things together with the VMware side. And then I'll jump into some demos. So these demos are pre-recorded. So as we're talking about performing firmware upgrades, there's a lot of waiting time whilst we wait for progress bars to move across the screen. So using the magic of video editing, I've sped up that boring part so we can see the good stuff in the time that we've got allocated today. So VMware Update Manager. So it's been around for a little while. So I think it came out in 2009 with the launch of vSphere 4, I believe. And what we've used that for in the past is to update our hosts. So that could be a major or minor release, so going from VMware 6.7 to 7 or 7 to 7.update1. And we've also used it for patching, so things like monthly security patches. And usually what we do is we create baselines and apply those baselines to the hosts, and then go through the process of rolling through the cluster to make sure our hosts are patched from a security perspective. We all remember the Spectrum meltdown patches that came out a couple of years back and the pain we went through to get those on board. We can also use it to put third-party VIBs onto the host. So it's not really common these days, but in days gone by, we used to be able to put vendor plugins, etc. Things like the Equalogic memory modules were a good candidate. We could deploy those using VUM. And finally, we can use it to upgrade the hardware and the VMware tools in the environment. So what are some of the challenges around VUM? So we've got some limited ability to accommodate firmware upgrades using VUM. So it's not a full picture. It's still really focused around the VMware software stack. It's done a good job over the years, but technology has really moved on. So where we are today, we've got technologies such as vSAN, and VUM actually predates vSAN. So vSAN is quite tightly integrated into the hardware stack. So our servers need specific versions of firmware on the storage controller, specific drivers for them to work. So there's far more integration these days between the software stack and the hardware stack, which makes it a bit challenging when it comes to updates. It's difficult to manage at scale as well. So if we're talking about multiple hosts and multiple clusters, making sure everything's at the same state, it's got the same version on, the same level of firmware, it's quite difficult to do, and it's quite time consuming for that process as well. And that leads it to be a bit error prone sometimes. Admins need to spend a lot of time researching compatibility versions, reading white papers, looking at what version works with what version of firmware, and the automation side isn't quite there. So if you're unlucky, you could see this. So this is what's known in the industry as a purple screen of death. So there's two things any seasoned VMware admin would have seen or done, and that's shred their fingers on cage nuts, which is the first thing everyone does, putting servers into racks, and dealt with a purple screen of death. So hopefully this isn't you, but I have seen support cases come in where customers have gone ahead and upgraded their ESXi version from 6 to 6.5 or something like that, and they haven't looked at the firmware, or they've not put the right level of firmware on those hosts, and we've ended up with a purple screen of death because we've got incompatible drivers and incompatible firmware. Typically, this could have been something like a dodgy network driver, crashing the host intermittently when it's under load. So it's really difficult to troubleshoot. So Is there a better way? Well, fortunately, the answer is yes. So in vSphere 7, we've got the introduction of the vSphere Lifecycle Manager. To start with, before I go into it, I'll just tell you the caveats that we've got around this, what you need to do to get started. So you have to be on vSphere 7 or later. So for those of you who are still on 6, 6.5 or 6.7, you need to get to 7 to use this first. We need to have the same hardware vendor in each cluster. So either all Dell or all HPE or all Lenovo, whatever your flavor of hardware vendor is, they have to be the same. So you can't mix vendors within the cluster for this to work. There's no support for stateless clusters either. So what that means is any of you guys out there using auto deploy, this won't work at the moment. Once a cluster is converted to Lifecycle Manager, that means there's no more VUM. So you can't go back. You can't revert back to using Update Manager once you've made that conversion. The only way you can do it is to create a new cluster and then move your hosts into that cluster and use VUM that way. If you're buying vSound Ready nodes, there is an attribute now in the VMware compatibility guide that will show if those nodes work with Lifecycle Manager or not. So that's quite useful. So Lifecycle Manager is a simpler approach. So what we got now is a concept of a desired state. So there's no more baselines to use, no more baselines to configure in VUM. What we do now is we create this desired state by building an image in Lifecycle Manager. So as the slide showing here, we've got our ESXi version, which is our base image. We then add a vendor add-on to that image. That's usually a driver pack of some sort. And then we use the hardware integration to push firmware and driver add-ons into that image as well. And we bundle all of that together, and that's called our lifecycle image. So this process is designed for managing hosts at cluster level. So we're not looking at managing hosts on an individual basis here. What we're doing is designing this to work at scale and have that consistency at scale as well. So what's really useful now is this, with this desired state, we can actually monitor our hosts and make sure they're in compliance. So they're running the version of code that we want with the right level of firmware. And for whatever reason, if that state changes, we can schedule configuration drift messages to alert us to when that host has gone out of compliance. So that could be if you've got a support issue and the vendor's told you to downgrade the driver, or you've had a card fail or something like that, and you've had hardware replacement. Sometimes you forget to check the firmware version, and you can put your host back into your cluster, and then you've got some non-compliance there. So you've got hosts running at different firmware version levels. So Lifecycle Manager is designed to spot this and help you remediate that problem with a click of a button. So that graphic may have been a little bit busy, but effectively a desired image is broken down into 3 parts. So realistically, it's an ESXi image, plus your vendor add-on and your firmware and drivers. So the 3 of those components all work together to give you this image, which then you use at a cluster level. So this works in conjunction with a hardware support manager. So in this case, I'm using Dell hosts. So the Dell hardware support manager is OpenManage, OMIVV, so OpenManage integration for VMware vCenter. That's a little bit of a mouthful. But effectively what that does is it handles the driver and firmware side of the Dell platform and passes that through to vCenter. And it works in the other way as well. So when we're looking at remediating hosts, that's the appliance that then drives the update. It talks to the DRAX to push those updates through. So it's quite straightforward to deploy OpenManage for vCenter. It's an OVA. So I have a demo coming up next where we'll go into that. But effectively, it's designed to streamline the process of managing Dell hardware in vCenter. So we can do things like monitor the status of our hardware components within vCenter. We can configure it to do alerting. So if we get things like a power supply failure, it can show you the alert in vCenter. And it also manages the firmware, like I said, with Lifecycle Manager. So how do you get it? So it's a free download from Dell. It's possible you may already have it when you purchase the servers. So there's a small charge for the licensing. But if not, and you want to try it, there's a free 90-day evaluation you can use once you download the appliance. And this allows you to manage up to 5 hosts to try it out first. So moving into the first demo that we've got. So this demo is quite straightforward. We've all deployed open appliances before. So basically it's a standard process of creating a host name, IP address, setting the NTP servers, all the good stuff it needs. With OpenManage, it's possible to have a second NIC attached. So this would be important if you've got a different out-of-band network for your iDRACs or management subnets. So this appliance needs to be able to communicate with both the vCenter server and the DRACs. So if you've got two separate networks for this, you'll need to add an additional NIC to here. So in the demo, I've deployed the appliance into my virtual environment. I'm now just booting it up for the first time and giving it a super secret, highly complex password, as most things require these days, and just running through now and doing the basic configuration settings, so setting the time zones, the NTP servers, the IP addresses, the DNS servers, for it to work correctly with vSphere. So once all that's done, effectively what we would then do is reboot the appliance and then register it using the GUI with our vCenter server. So there's a couple of steps here to do. So the first step is to register the appliance with vCenter itself. And this is what you've traditionally done in the past if you've ever used this before. With Lifecycle Manager in 7, there's an option to there tick a box to also register it with Lifecycle Manager. So what I'm doing now is just logging in using my vCenter credentials. As this is a lab, I'm just using the administrator account, but obviously in the real world, you would use RBAC and create a role for this service account. And we're just going to go through and register it now with both the vCenter server and the LCM. And then once that's complete, what we'll see is then a plugin appear in our vCenter browser once we go ahead and refresh. So the little bar at the top there, just click refresh. And what we'll get now in the drop-down menu and on the home page is a nice little icon for OpenManage. The dashboard here is looking a bit sparse at the moment because it's only just been installed. So our next videos we'll go through and do some configuration. So moving on to our second video. So this is the configuration. So this is the base configuration of OpenManage for vSphere. So what I'm going to do now is go into the plugin. So you can either get that from the shortcuts page or from the drop-down menu. We go into the settings and I'm just going to run through the initial configuration wizard. So what I'm going to do is choose my vCenter. I'm going to create a host profile and then configure settings for scanning and things like that. So a host credential profile is what we need to use first to create a connection to our iDRACs. So I'm just going to give this a name of the DT profile for this example. And then I'm going to pop in my iDRAC credentials here. So I'm just using root and the well-known Dell password. Please change that to something more secure if you still use that in your environment. We don't need to use any host root credentials because I'm already on vSphere 7. And then what I'm going to do is assign that to my environment here. So it's picked up the 3 hosts I've got in the lab. So I'll run a quick test just to make sure there's connectivity to the DRACs and then click finish. So now I've created my profile for that. Next, I'm just going to quickly run through and create settings just to run an inventory. So that just rescans my environment on a scheduled basis to pick up any changes. And I'm also going to create a schedule to retrieve warranty status as well. So that's quite useful just to keep an eye on your warranty status of your hosts automatically. You can also choose to configure any alarms if you want to. I'm not in this demo. And then there's a little example here of what you need to do for the next steps to get started, creating cluster profiles and firmware profiles. So we'll do that in the next video. So once I'm done here, I can see now I'm consuming some licenses in the demo platform. I will go into my hosts, and what I can see in the panel, the main panel of vCenter, is some additional information now from OMIVV, showing me things like host build versions, the iDRAC IP address, the firmware and BIOS versions, and things like that. So some useful information that you can see here, and you can click through to launch the DRACs if you wanted to. So as you can see, quite straightforward to deploy, quite easy to set up and get working in your environment. So that's OpenManage. So the next demonstration we got here is the main Lifecycle Manager demonstration here. So to get started, what I've done is I've created a cluster in VMware and popped 2 hosts into it. And first of all, I'm going to go into the OpenManage software. and click on the compliance and deployment, and I'm going to create some profiles. So what I need to do first is create a firmware repository profile here. So I've already downloaded and configured Dell Repository Manager in the background and added the driver packs for my R640s. So I'm going to choose this as a firmware repository here, so I don't need any drivers. It's not a vSAN cluster. So these are published using a network share. So I'm just going to put the share details in here. And that points to the catalog file in Dell Repository Manager that I've configured. And then I'm just going to use some credentials then to connect to that share. So again, I'm not following best practices here. I'm using the administrator account. Again, in the real world, please use a secure account here. That's restricted in what I can and can't do. So a quick test just to make sure I've got connectivity. And then this is just going to say when it's going to synchronize with that repository. So I've now created that firmware repo and I've got that available to use. Next, what I need to do is create a cluster profile. So this cluster profile effectively ties that firmware repository to a cluster in vSphere. So what I'm going to do now is create a brand new profile for this cluster. So I'll just give it a name. And then what I'm going to do is associate that with my firmware repository. So that's one I created in the previous step. You can also use a Dell default catalog if you wanted to, but that just pulls down the latest version of every single driver. In this demo, I'm just filtered it to the most common drivers to save a bit of time. So I'm going to now associate that with the cluster. So this just will present that firmware repository to this cluster. And I come to set up Lifecycle Manager. And then I can set my drift detection here. So this is how frequently I'm going to scan the environment to make sure it's in compliance. So once I've done that, I now have my repository and my cluster profiles created in OpenManage. I'm going to go back to vCenter and I'm going to go to the cluster and then I'm going to click on the Updates tab. So those of you that are familiar with vSphere will recognize this. This is VUM. So this is the Update Manager console where we've traditionally used our baselines. So we don't want to use that anymore. So I'm going to click the Manage with Single Image button, and this converts us over to use Lifecycle Manager. So again, please take note of the prerequisites. So what I'm going to do now is set up our image. If you remember that graphic from VMware, I'm going to have the 3 components that I need to make this image. So first of all, I'm quite happy with the version of vSphere I'm running at the moment. It's the latest release of 7. So that's what I'm going to choose, is our base image. I'm then going to choose our vendor add-on. So in this environment, I'm running Dell R640 hosts. So I'm going to choose the relevant pack for the version of vSphere I'm running. So that's ESXi 7. And as you can see, there's some custom drivers in that pack that will get bundled into this image. And next, I'm going to choose my firmware profile. So I've got my hardware support manager deployed, IBV, and I've created a cluster profile for this cluster, which is attached to that firmware repository. So I can choose this. I'm then going to validate the build to make sure everything's okay, and then hit save to create this image and effectively apply it to the cluster. So what I would do now is just check the compliance of the host against this. And then the final step, once that's done, is just to click finish and complete the creation of that image here. So down on the bottom left, hit finish image setup. And there's a warning there to say, once you've done this, there's no going back to VUM. So just click here just to say you're happy to do that. And now what I can see is the compliance state of the hosts I've got in this cluster. So looking at my host here, I can see that the firmware is out of date. So I've got a BIOS update that needs to happen. So on the host, I'm a version behind what's in the image. And again, with the iDRAC controller, I'm a few versions behind on firmware here. And that's the same for the second host as well. So this is only showing what's called the drift comparison. So this is the differences. So the differences between the state of my hosts and the image it's being compared to. So now I'll run through a quick pre-check just to make sure everything's okay. So there's no issues found. So what I can do now is go and remediate these hosts. So I can either do that on an individual basis by clicking the little buttons next to each host, or I can just go and roll it through the cluster, which is what I'm going to do in this demo. So this is just telling me what the impact's going to be on my cluster. So obviously hosts are going to be rebooted to get them into compliance. There's familiar settings here. So you'll have seen these in VUM before, which controls HA and quick boot and things like that. Sign your life away, accepting the terms and conditions in the end user license agreement, and then click go. So this process will take a little bit of time normally. I think it took nearly an hour just to do 2 hosts. So effectively what's happening now is it's going through and flashing the BIOS, so we can see I'm on the iDRAC. So that updated the BIOS for me. Obviously I'm running this video at super speed here, so this takes a little while to go through and do that. And it's going to go through and just reboot back into the same version of vSphere. So I've not really touched the vSphere upgrade here. I'm just concentrating on the firmware for now. It will then roll through the cluster, so it will vMotion all the VMs to the second host and then go and patch and remediate the next host in the cluster. So what we'll see at the end of this, we've got 2 hosts that are now compliant with this image. So all the hosts in that cluster have now got the correct version of vSphere, the correct vendor add-ons, and the correct drivers installed. So that's the process. As you can see, 1 cycle I've gone through and made sure everything's in compliance in terms of the ESXi version, the add-ons, and the firmware versions. So what about upgrades? So what do we do when we want to upgrade, let's say, from vSphere 6.7 to 7, or actually it should be 7 to 7 update 1 because it doesn't work with vSphere 6.7. We can go and edit our image. So what we can do here is go and hit the edit button here, and we can actually change the ESXi version we want to go to. So in this environment, I'm going to go to update 1 and the latest build of update 1. Because I'm going to update 1, I need to change my vendor add-on. So there's now a specific pack for update 1 here in the catalog. So I'll choose that to build our image. And this just shows me the drivers that are going to be installed. So I've already dealt with the firmware before in the last demo. So that's already up to the latest version. So I can ignore that for now. I will just then revalidate the image and then save it. And then effectively what will happen now is it will just go through and check the compliance of the host as we did before. But this time we can see there's a couple more bits of information down the bottom in terms of the ESXi version is now out of compliance. So it's running a version behind, and the vendor add-ons again are out of compliance. So again, running a version behind. So what we need to do now is just remediate these hosts. So what will happen as part of this process is it will pull out those vendor add-ons from 7 and put the update 1 pack in. So quick boot's supported on this host. So quick boot's really good. It speeds up the reboot process by, rather than doing a full reboot, it just does a kernel reload. So we need to enable this in the cluster settings. So when doing software upgrades, so when we're not touching the firmware, this can save a lot of time because the reboots effectively are a couple of minutes rather than sort of 10 to 15 minutes. So I recommend turning that on if your hosts support it. So again, we're now going to go through and remediate these hosts. So as before, check the settings, accept the end user license agreement. We can see that quick boot's enabled, and then we can hit start remediation. So what I'll do is open the DRAC again. So when it gets to this host and reboots it, you can see the difference. So it's now rebooting that host. But if you watch carefully, you won't see any BIOS screens. It just effectively reloads the kernel straight away. So it's far quicker now using quick boot to remediate software versions. So that's done. So that's both those hosts upgraded to update 1. So if we can just go into the vCenter client and just see, yeah, that patch version 7.0.1, those hosts are now running vSphere 7 update 1. So that's the upgrade side of things sorted. So the last demonstration I've got for you today is to talk about configuration drift, which is the important part of this process as well. So what happens if we put a host in? So in this example, I've got 2 hosts here that are already in compliance. I've got a third host, so I need some extra capacity. Perhaps I've just bought this, or I pulled it out of a dev environment. I've been told it's running the right version of vSphere. They said, yeah, it's got update 1 on there. But I've not got time to check, so I'm just going to pop it into the cluster and let Lifecycle Manager sort it out for me. So what I'm going to do now is just kick off a manual drift detection. So normally this process runs overnight, but just to speed things up a bit, I'll do it manually. So I'll go into the job settings, find my drift detection job, and just click run. So that will fire off a manual drift detection job, I can then go back into compliance and then see that job. So I can now see it's showing as non-compliant. So what that means in that cluster, if I scroll down to the bottom, I've got 2 hosts that are fine and 1 that's non-compliant. So what I can actually do is view the drift report here, and I can actually see what components are non-compliant. So that's showing me all the firmware versions here that are out of compliance. So I can see I've got Ethernet adapters, I've got the iDRAC, the BIOS, I think boot card on there as well. So there's a few components on there that aren't running the correct firmware versions. So what I'm going to do now is just go back into my vCenter server. So you can also see that as filter. You can filter it on urgent and critical items as well if you want to have a little bit more of a breakdown. So going back to the vCenter server cluster, I can now refresh and just do an image check on these hosts, and I can see that host 3 is showing out of compliance, and there's a big list. So we've got a few issues with this host. We've got an ESXi version that's out of compliance. We're missing the vendor add-ons, and we're missing the firmware from this host. So there's a fair bit of work to do to bring this into compliance. Fortunately, with Lifecycle Manager, one of the benefits is we can do all of these upgrades in one hit. So we can put on the latest version of ESXi, we can sort out the vendor add-ons, and we can fix the driver issues. So I'm just going to go and remediate this cluster now. Again, accept the license agreements, and this is just going to run through. So in the essence of time, I'm just going to skip through to the end. And what's going to happen now is all of that's done. So that process is just patched all my firmware, updated my ESXi, and I've got all my clusters in compliance now. So if I go back to the compliance view and the main window, I can now see if I run the job again. So find my job and click run now. What I should see is once that's completed, the hosts should now all be in compliance, which they are. So it's a real easy way just to see the state of your hardware across your environment, all of your clusters, from just using vCenter. Okay, so that's the end of the demonstrations. So in summary, what do you need to do to use Lifecycle Manager? So realistically, get to vSphere 7 first. It doesn't work with anything earlier than that. So you'll have to use VUM and manual firmware updates to get to that level, that baseline. The second question, just check, are you licensed for OpenManage integration for vSphere already? It may have been when you purchased your host, you may have had the licenses already. If not, it's a small charge to get the functionality this brings. It saves a ton of time, so why wouldn't you? If you are licensed, deploy the OVA. As you can see, it's quite straightforward to deploy and get up and running. Once the base configuration has been done, just create your desired state, your image, what versions you need to be on. Remediate your hosts, and then you can just continue to monitor your environment to make sure all your hosts and hardware are staying in compliance. So hopefully that will make your lives easier moving forward. More stability, less time troubleshooting, and just an easier life. So as Hannibal would say, I love it when a plan comes together. So that's the last meeting with this presentation. So with that, if you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A box. I'll get back to you with any questions you have on this presentation. And this wraps everything up. So I'd like to say thank you very much for watching and giving me your time. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Define tomorrow.